I need your help. They say you know things, plant things, things that can affect a person's health.
What you asking me to do?
My husband has a weak constitution, chest pains, headaches. You could prepare him a tonic, something to help him sleep better, something he would take every night with his brandy.
And if I say no,
Then I tell my husband you have been practicing witchcraft, poisons, threatening white folks. You know what happens to Negroes accused of such things in Georgia.
Not even my no belongs to me.
Help me and I will give you your freedom.
In the darkest corners of history are stories that powerful people hoped would never see the light of day. Stories of exploitation disguised as opportunity, of hope transformed into tragedy. This is one of those stories, and once you hear it, you may never look at history the same way again. My name doesn't matter. I'm just the keeper of memories that refuse to die, the voice for those who had theirs stolen. And tonight, I need to tell you about Mama Akosua, a woman whose wisdom was both her greatest gift and her final curse. It was the summer of 1857 in Whitmore County, Georgia, where the air hung thick and heavy like a wet wool blanket, where the cotton fields stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, and where human beings were bought and sold like cattle at the market square every Tuesday morning. The Thornhill Plantation sat on 3,000 acres of blood-soaked soil, a grand white mansion with columns that reached toward heaven while hell unfolded in the quarters behind it. Oh, how that house gleamed in the sunlight, all that white paint covering so much darkness. Master Richard Thornhill was a man of reputation, 53 years old, barrel-chested, with gray creeping into his sideburns and a walking cane he didn't need but carried anyway because it made him feel important. In church on Sundays, he'd sit in the front pew, nodding along to sermons about Christian charity, while 200 souls he claimed to own worked his fields from can't see to can't see. The other plantation owners respected him. The merchants in town tipped the hats. His wife, Constance, played the piano at social gatherings and smiled that tight-lipped smile that Southern ladies perfected like an art form. The Constance Thornhill, 20 years younger than her husband, was a woman with ambitions that plantation life couldn't satisfy. She'd married Richard when she was 18, a poor girl from Savannah who saw a way out of poverty and took it without looking back. 15 years later, she sat in that big house surrounded by silk and silver, and she wanted more. She wanted everything. And standing in her way was a husband who controlled every penny, every decision, every breath she took. Then there was Mama Akosua, 72 years old, bent like a question mark from decades of labor, her hands gnarled like tree roots, her eyes still sharp as broken glass. She'd been born in a village near the Gold Coast, stolen when she was just 8 years old, survived the Middle Passage in the belly of a ship where children died like flies, and somehow, she'd kept the old knowledge alive. The knowledge of herbs and roots, of prayers to Nyame and the ancestors, of remedies that could heal or harm, depending on the intention behind them. The white folks on the plantation called her Old Auntie, that degrading term they used to strip away identity and dignity. They came to her shack when their own doctors failed them, when their children burned with fever or their stomachs twisted with pain. They took her knowledge and gave nothing but scraps in return. Mama Akosua would mix her remedies, speaking words in tea under her breath, words they couldn't understand and therefore dismissed as harmless mumbling. But those words were prayers, were resistance, were the last threads connecting her to a home she'd never see again. I can still picture her quarters, that small shack at the edge of the slave quarters where bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, sage and feverfew, boneset and pennyroyal, roots whose names she only spoke in the old language. The smell of earth and medicine permeated everything. At night, when the overseer had drunk himself to sleep and the watchdogs were quiet, other enslaved people would come to her. She'd teach the young ones the stories, the songs, the ways of knowing that made them more than what slavery tried to reduce them to. It was a Tuesday evening in July when Constance Thornhill first came to Mama Akoso's door. Not during the day, mind you. No, she waited until twilight, until the shadows were long enough to hide her shame at needing help from someone she considered barely human. She knocked twice, soft and uncertain, and when Mama Akosa opened that warped wooden door, their eyes met in a moment that would seal both their fates. "I need your help," Constance said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wore a dark cloak despite the heat, trying to make herself invisible. "They say you know things, plant things, things that can affect a person's health." Mama Akosa stood there in the doorway, reading this white woman like she'd read 100 others before her. She knew what this was. She'd seen it before. The desperate wife, the unwanted husband, the poison disguised as medicine. And right then, right in that moment, she should have closed the door, should have said no, should have protected herself from what was coming. But Constance Thornhill said 6 words that changed everything. "I can give you your freedom." Freedom. The word hung in the humid air like a prayer, like a dream, like a lie waiting to be born. Mama Akosa's heart, that tired old heart that had beaten through 72 years of bondage, skipped and stumbled. Freedom. She'd given up on that word decades ago, had buried it alongside all the other impossible things. But here it was, being offered like a gift, like a promise, like salvation itself. "I have the papers drawn up already, signed and sealed. The moment my husband, the moment I inherit this plantation, you'll be free. Free to go wherever you want. I'll even give you money for passage north." Mama Akosa's hands trembled as she reached for that paper, and that moment, that terrible, beautiful moment of hope, was the beginning of the end. The document felt like fire in Mama Akosa's weathered hands. She couldn't read English, not really, just enough to recognize her name spelled out in careful script. Akosa, female Negro, age approximately 70 years. The rest was just loops and lines that might as well have been written in water for all the trust they deserved. But Constance Thornhill stood there in the doorway of that shack, her pale face catching the last light of day, and she looked so sincere, so desperate, so convincing. "What you asking me to do?" Mama Akosa finally spoke, her voice carrying the accent of 3 languages merged into one. The words came slow, careful, because she already knew the answer but needed to hear it spoken plain. Constance glanced over her shoulder at the path leading back to the big house. "My husband has a weak constitution. He complains of pains in his chest, headaches, digestive troubles. You could prepare him a tonic, something to help him sleep better, ease his discomfort, something he'd take every night with his brandy." She paused, let the implications settle like sediment in still water. Nature would simply take its course. There it was, murder dressed up in polite words. Mama Akosa felt the weight of what was being asked, felt it pressing down on her bent spine like another 100 pounds of cotton. She looked at this white woman, this lady of the house who had everything but wanted more, who would use an old enslaved woman as her weapon and call it mercy. "And if I say no?" Mama Akosa asked, though she knew that answer too. Constance's face changed then, the mask of desperation sliding into something harder, colder. "Then I tell my husband you've been practicing witchcraft, brewing poisons, threatening white folks. You know what happens to Negroes accused of such things." She didn't need to elaborate. They both knew about the whippings, the brandings, the bodies left hanging from trees as warnings. Mama Akosa looked down at the freedom paper again, at her name written there like it was a real thing, like she was a real person with rights and choices. 72 years old. How many years did she have left? 5, 10 if God was merciful? 72 years of being property, and here was a chance to die free, to spend whatever time remained walking on her own feet, answering to no master, maybe even finding some of her people up north. "I do this," she said slowly. "You give me this paper soon, before anything happened to Master Thornhill." Constance shook her head, that tight smile appearing again. "No, darling, after, when I inherit, when I'm mistress of this plantation with no husband to question my decisions, then you'll get your freedom, not before. That's how trust works between us." Trust. The word was obscene coming from a white woman's mouth, spoken to a woman who'd been chattel since childhood. But what choice was there? Mama Akosa nodded once, slow and heavy as a judge's gavel, and Constance Thornhill smiled like they'd just agreed on flower arrangements for a garden party. "I'll send for you tomorrow," Constance said, tucking the freedom paper back into her cloak. "Bring your medicines to the big house. Tell anyone who asks that you're treating the master's insomnia." Then she was gone, disappearing into the dusk like a ghost, leaving Mama Akosa standing in her doorway with the smell of herbs and the weight of damnation all around her. That night, Mama Akosa sat on the floor of her shack and did something she hadn't done in years. She built a small altar, the way her grandmother had taught her before the slavers came. A white cloth spread on the ground, a bowl of water, 3 stones from the river, a lock of her own white hair. She spoke in tea, words that came from somewhere deep in her memory, calling on Nyame, on Asaseya, on the ancestors who'd crossed the water and the ones who died on these shores. "Nananam, hear me," she whispered into the darkness. "I am lost. Show me the path." But the ancestors were silent, or maybe she'd forgotten how to hear them after all these years. All she heard was the sound of the other enslaved people in nearby shacks, coughing, crying, singing low songs to ease the day's pain. All she felt was the arthritis in her joints and the exhaustion in her bones and the terrible, seductive pull of that promise, freedom. The next morning came too quickly. The sun rose red and angry over the cotton fields, and with it came a house slave named Beulah, a girl of about 16 who'd been born into this hell and knew nothing else. "Mistress wants you at the big house," Beulah said, her eyes curious and afraid. "Say bring your medicine bag." Nana Akosa gathered her things, her hands moving through familiar motions. Dried foxglove for the heart, monk's hood root, deadly if prepared wrong, nightshade berries, innocent looking as any fruit. She knew exactly what Constance wanted, what combination would bring sleep that deepened into something permanent, what would look like natural causes to any doctor who examined the body. The walk to the big house felt longer than it ever had before, through the quarters where children played in the dirt because they were too young yet for field work, past the cookhouse where the smell of biscuits being prepared for the master's table made her stomach turn, up the path to the back entrance, the servants' entrance, because enslaved people didn't walk through front doors no matter what errand they were on. Constance met her in the kitchen, dismissing the cook with a wave of her hand. "Well?" she asked, her voice sharp with impatience. Nana Akosa set her bag on the wooden table, heard the dried herbs rustle inside like whispered warnings. If you're enjoying this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to uncover. The kitchen of the Thornhill mansion was a world unto itself. Copper pots hung from hooks like harvest moons. The massive fireplace dominated one wall, its stones blackened from years of constant use. The smell of rising bread mixed with the sharper scent of lye soap and wood smoke. This was where the enslaved people created the abundance that graced the master's table while they themselves ate scraps and cornmeal. Mama Acosa spread her collection of dried plants across the table's scarred surface. Constance watched with poorly disguised fascination and revulsion, the way someone might watch a snake being milked for venom, useful but dangerous, necessary but contaminating. "This here," Mama Acosa said, touching a bundle of purple flowers with her gnarled finger, "foxglove, good for the heart when used right, make it beat strong and steady." She paused, letting the implication breathe. "Too much, though, make it beat wild and strange, stop altogether if the dose increase over time." Constance leaned closer, her pale fingers hovering over the plants but not quite touching them, as if contact might transfer some essential contamination. And it wouldn't be detected? No one would know? Heart trouble common in men his age, especially men who eat rich, drink heavy, get angry quick. Doctor just shake his head, say his time come. Nobody question natural causes. The word natural tasted like ash in her mouth. There was nothing natural about any of this. Not the slavery, not the murder, not the twisted bargain between a desperate white woman and an enslaved one with nothing left to lose but a few years of misery. Constance straightened, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. How long? Depend on how strong his constitution. Few weeks, maybe month. Little bit in his evening brandy every night. He just get weaker, more tired, think he catching sick. Perfect. Constance's smile was terrible to see, hungry and cold as a winter dawn. Prepare the first dose now. I'll mix it into his brandy myself tonight. And remember, Akasoa," she leaned in close enough that Mama Akasoa could smell the rose water perfume covering the woman's sweat. "Our little arrangement stays between us. You tell anyone, and that freedom paper disappears faster than morning dew." Mama Akasoa nodded, her hands already moving to grind the dried foxglove with a mortar and pestle. The rhythmic sound filled the kitchen, a whisper of stone against stone, of fate being ground into powder. She added a measure of other herbs to mask the bitterness, creating a mixture that would dissolve clear in brandy, tasteless and invisible as betrayal itself. When it was done, she poured the powder into a small glass vial, corked it tight, and handed it to Constance. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Mama Akasoa felt a coldness transfer between them, like touching a corpse. "1 pinch each night, no more, no less. Patience is what keep this looking natural." Constance tucked the vial into the pocket of her apron, then pulled out a silver dollar and placed it on the table. The coin sat there gleaming, an insult masquerading as payment. For murder, for complicity, for selling what remained of a soul already carved into pieces by slavery. Mama Akasoa left the big house through the back door, the silver dollar heavy in her pocket, heavier than any amount of money had a right to be. As she walked back toward the quarters, she passed the fields where dozens of enslaved people moved between cotton rows under the watchful eyes of the overseer, a red-faced man named Caleb who carried a whip the way some men carried Bibles. "Afternoon, Auntie," called a voice from near the well. It was Samuel, a man of about 40 who'd been on the Thornhill plantation his whole life. His back carried scars from a whipping he'd received 5 years ago for looking at a white woman too long. "You looking troubled?" Mama Acosa stopped, studied his kind face, and felt the weight of her secret pressing against her ribs. "Just tired, Samuel. These old bones don't work like they used to." "None of us work like we used to," replied with a sad smile. "But we still here, still surviving. That count for something, don't it?" "Maybe so, maybe so." But as she continued toward her shack, Mama Akosua wondered what survival meant when it came at the cost of becoming the very thing she'd always resisted, a weapon for white people to use against each other. That night, in the big house, Richard Thornhill took his evening brandy in the study like he did every night. Constance poured it herself, something she'd rarely done before. The foxglove powder dissolved invisible into the amber liquid. He drank it down, complained about the heat, about the laziness of the field hands, about the price of cotton, about all the small tyrannies that consumed his thoughts. Then he went to bed, slept soundly, and woke the next morning feeling no different than usual. This was how it would go, night after night. A small dose, barely perceptible, a slow accumulation in his body like sediment settling at the bottom of a river. Death taking his time, wearing the mask of natural decline. In Mama Akosua's shack, Akosua lay on her thin mattress stuffed with corn husks and stared at the darkness. She thought about the freedom paper hidden in Constance's possession. She thought about her grandmother's village, about the ocean crossing, about 72 years of being owned. She thought about how easy it was to make a person into a monster when you took away every other choice. And in the darkness, she began to prepare herself for what was coming, because in her heart, in the part of her that still remembered the old wisdom, she knew that white people's promises to black folks were written in water. 3 weeks passed like a slow funeral procession. Each evening, Constance Thornhill administered the poison with steady hands and a smile on her face. Each morning, Richard woke a little more tired, a little more short of breath, his complexion taking on a grayish tint that made him look like old newspaper left in the sun. The other plantation owners who came to visit noticed his decline. "You looking poorly, Richard," said Colonel Ashford over cigars and bourbon on the veranda. "Maybe you should see the doctor from Augusta." "It's just age catching up," Richard wheezed, loosening his collar because everything felt too tight lately. "Man reaches 53, things start wearing down. Nothing to be done about it but accept it." Constance stood nearby, fanning herself with a painted silk fan, playing the concerned wife to perfection. "I've been so worried about him," she told the other plantation ladies who came for afternoon tea. "He refuses to slow down, insists on riding out to inspect the fields every day, despite the heat. You know how stubborn men can be." Oh, how they nodded and sympathized, these women in their hoop skirts and jewels bought with blood money. They sipped tea from china cups, while in the fields, people collapsed from heat exhaustion and were whipped for the crime of being too weak to continue. Mama Akusa watched it all from a distance. She saw Richard growing weaker. She saw Constance's barely concealed satisfaction, and she saw the other enslaved people noticing that something was changing, sensing the shift in the air the way animals sense a coming storm. "Master looking real sick," said Beulah one morning as she helped Mama Akusa gather herbs from the small garden plot behind her shack. The girl's hands moved quick and practiced through the plants, selecting leaves with the casual expertise of someone who'd been doing it since childhood. "Mistress say his heart giving him trouble." "Hearts do that when they get old and tired. All we can do is pray for him." "You pray for Master Thornhill?" Beulah's voice carried surprise and something darker, something that sounded like disappointment. "After all he done?" Mama Akosa looked up then, met those young eyes full of anger and incomprehension. "Child, I pray for everybody. Praying don't cost nothing, and the Lord decide what to do with it." But at night, alone in her shack, she didn't pray. Instead, she sat before her small altar and spoke to the ancestors in words that felt rusty from disuse. She told them what she'd done, confessed it like sin, like strategy, like survival. And she asked them to forgive her or judge her or just witness what necessity had made of her. On the fourth week, Richard Thornhill collapsed while getting dressed for breakfast. The house erupted into chaos. Enslaved people ran for the doctor in town. Constance screamed appropriately, tore at her hair with what looked like genuine grief. Richard was carried to his bed, his face the color of old parchment, his breathing shallow and labored. Dr. Waverly arrived within the hour, a portly man with mutton chops and an air of absolute authority. He examined Richard thoroughly, listened to his heart, checked his pulse, studied his eyes and tongue. Finally, he emerged from the bedroom shaking his head gravely. "His heart is given out," he announced to Constance and the gathered house slaves. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done. Keep him comfortable, give him laudanum for the pain. It's in God's hands now." Constance accepted this pronouncement with appropriate distress, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. But Mama Akosa, standing in the corner of the room where enslaved people were invisible until needed, saw the flash of triumph in the white woman's eyes, saw the calculation, the anticipation of widowhood and wealth. Richard Thornhill lingered for 3 more days, drifting in and out of consciousness. The plantation held its breath. Work continued in the fields because Cotton didn't care about dying masters, but a strange tension settled over everything. Change was coming. Everyone could feel it. On the third night, around 2 in the morning, Richard's heart finally stopped. The enslaved woman who'd been sitting with him, a girl named Ruth, ran to wake Constance. The mistress came to her husband's bedside in a nightgown, her hair in papers, and looked down at his still face with an expression that might have been relief. "He's gone," she whispered. Then louder, with manufactured grief, "He's gone. Oh, God, Richard!" The plantation awoke to the news as dawn broke. Master Thornhill was dead. The white folks in the big house went into mourning, draping black cloth over mirrors and stopping the clocks. The enslaved people in the quarters went about their work with the same exhaustion as always, though some of them wondered what this death would mean for them. Would they be sold off to pay debts? Would the new mistress be crueler or kinder? Would anything actually change, or would slavery just continue under a different hand? Mama Akausa heard the news and felt her chest tighten. She retreated to her shack and sat on the floor, staring at her hands. These hands that had healed people. These hands that had mixed the poison. These hands that had reached for the promise of freedom and closed around empty air. She knew what was supposed to happen next. Constance would become mistress of the plantation, the will would be read, and then supposedly she would receive her freedom paper, would walk away from Thornhill Plantation a free woman, would head north, would die as something other than property. But in her gut, in the part of her that had survived 72 years of white people's lies, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. She knew the price of murder wasn't paid in freedom papers. She just didn't know yet how high that price would climb. The funeral was a spectacle of Southern propriety. Richard Thornhill was laid to rest in the family cemetery with a headstone that proclaimed him a beloved husband, respected landowner, and Christian gentleman. The preacher spoke about his generosity and his contribution to the community. The other plantation owners stood in their black suits and nodded solemnly. Their wives wept delicate tears into embroidered handkerchiefs. Not a single word was spoken about the 200 human beings he'd owned like livestock. Not a mention of the families he'd torn apart, selling children away from mothers because it was profitable. Not a whisper about the whippings he'd ordered, the rapes he'd permitted, the systematic brutality that kept his cotton empire running. History would remember Richard Thornhill as a gentleman. The truth would be buried with the bodies in unmarked graves scattered across his fields. Constance played the grieving widow with theatrical precision. She wore black silk that rustled like dry leaves. She leaned on the arms of concerned friends. She accepted condolences with a trembling voice and downcast eyes. And through it all, Mama Akosa watched from the designated area where enslaved people were permitted to stand during white folks' ceremonies, far enough away to maintain the fiction of separation, close enough to serve if needed. Their eyes met once across the graveyard, just for a moment, and in that moment, Mama Akosa saw something that made her blood run cold. Not gratitude, not conspiracy, but calculation. The look a person gives something they're about to discard. 2 days after the funeral, on a humid Tuesday morning that smelled of rain, Constance summoned Mama Akosa to the big house, not to the kitchen this time, to the parlor, the room where white folks conducted their important business. Mama Akosa entered through the back door, was escorted by Beulah to the parlor where Constance sat in a high-backed chair like a queen on a throne. The new widow had already stopped wearing full mourning, had traded the heavy black silk for a lighter gray that made her look younger, less burdened. Sitting beside her was a man Mama Akosa had never seen before, thin as a rail with spectacles perched on a long nose. A lawyer, she guessed, a dealer in papers and property.
"Ah, there she is," Constance said, her voice carrying a strange lightness. "Mr. Peterson, this is the one I told you about, the Negro woman who cared for my late husband in his final days." The lawyer looked at Mama Akosia the way someone might look at a questionable piece of furniture, assessing value, noting defects. She stood there with her head properly lowered, playing the role slavery demanded, while her heart began to pound with the rhythm of approaching disaster. "Now, Akosia," Constance continued, standing and walking closer with small, precise steps, "I want to thank you for all your efforts to ease my husband's suffering. Your remedies were quite effective." The emphasis on remedies was deliberate, a warning, a reminder of complicity. "Yes'm," Mama Akosia murmured, keeping her eyes on the floor. "In fact," Constance went on, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, almost kind, "I was just telling Mr. Peterson about a concern that's been troubling me. You see, in going through Richard's effects, I found a disturbing journal entry from about a month before his death. In it, he mentions feeling unwell, mentions that you had been bringing him special tonics." Mama Akosia's head snapped up. "Mistress, I only—" He wrote, pulling a leather-bound journal from the table beside her, that the tonics made him feel worse, not better, that he suspected you were giving him something harmful, that he'd been meaning to have you whipped and questioned, but kept putting it off. Lies, all lies. Richard Thornhill had never written any such thing. The journal was probably real, but those words, those accusations, they'd been added recently in a woman's hand disguised as a man's scrawl. Mama Akosia could see it clearly now, could see the trap closing like iron jaws around her neck. I never hurt Master Thornhill. I only try to help with his sleeping trouble. Mistress know that. Mistress, you the one who what? Constance's voice turned sharp as a blade. I never asked you for anything inappropriate, Akasoa. I asked you to help my husband sleep better. If you took it upon yourself to administer something harmful, if you used your African witchcraft to poison a good Christian man, that's on your conscience, not mine. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Thornhill, are you suggesting this slave murdered your husband? I'm suggesting, Constance said carefully, that my husband's sudden decline and death following the administration of tonics prepared by this woman is deeply suspicious. I'm suggesting that perhaps the authorities should investigate, unless, she paused, let the word hang like a noose, unless Akasoa has something to say that might explain things differently. This was the moment. This was when Mama Akasoa could have spoken the truth, could have told the lawyer about Constance's visit to her shack, about the freedom paper, about the murder plot, could have dragged this white woman down with her. But who would believe an enslaved woman's word against a white widow's word? Who would take the testimony of property over the tearful accusations of a grieving Christian lady? The lawyer was already looking at Mama Akasoa like she was something contaminated. Even if she told the truth wouldn't save her. It would only make her death more certain, more painful. I got nothing to say, Mama Akasoa whispered, the fight draining out of her like water from cupped hands. Nothing but that I never meant no harm, never wanted nothing but to help. Constance's smile was triumphant and terrible. Then I have no choice but to report this matter to Sheriff Cooper. A man is dead, possibly murdered, and justice must be served. Sheriff Martin Cooper arrived at the Thornhill plantation that same afternoon, riding a chestnut mare and wearing the kind of self-importance that men in power wrap around themselves like armor. He was 42 years old, had a tobacco-stained mustache, and had never met a black person he considered fully human. In his world, enslaved people were either useful, troublesome, or criminal. Mama Akusa had just been promoted to the last category. Constance met him on the veranda, still playing the delicate widow, though her performance had shifted slightly. Less grief now, more righteous anger, more violated innocence seeking justice. Sheriff, thank you for coming so quickly, she said, guiding him into the parlor where Mr. Peterson, the lawyer, still sat, organizing papers into neat stacks. I wouldn't have troubled you if it wasn't serious, but murder, well, that's a matter for the law, isn't it? Murder's a strong word, Mrs. Thornhill, Cooper said, removing his hat and settling his considerable weight into a chair that creaked in protest. You got proof this Negro killed your husband? Constance presented the journal, the supposedly incriminating entries highlighted with strips of ribbon. She presented testimony from house slaves who'd been coached on what to say, girls like Beulah who had no choice but to repeat the words they'd been given. She presented the timeline of Richard's decline, made it sound sinister rather than natural. "And the motive, Sheriff," she said, leaning forward with wide, innocent eyes. "I believe she was practicing witchcraft, African witchcraft. My husband had recently mentioned his intention to forbid such practices on the plantation. He suspected her of conducting heathen rituals, of communing with dark spirits. Perhaps she killed him to prevent being stopped." The sheriff's face hardened at the word witchcraft. This was Georgia in 1857, where white folks might use enslaved people's knowledge of herbs when it suited them, but they also feared it, feared anything that suggested power they couldn't control. "Voodoo," the sheriff declared, holding up the figure like it was a snake. "Devil worship, witchcraft, plain as day." "It's not," Mama Akosa started, then stopped. What was the point? These people had already decided what they wanted to see. Her sacred objects were evidence of evil. Her knowledge of healing plants was proof of poisoning. Her very survival across 72 years of hell was somehow suspicious, somehow threatening. They took everything, burned it right there in front of her shack while the other enslaved people watched in silent horror. The herbs that could heal fevers, the roots that could ease childbirth, the remedies that had saved lives, both black and white, for 4 decades, all of it reduced to ash and smoke while Constance Thornhill watched from the veranda with satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. That night, Mama Akosa was locked in the storm cellar beneath the big house. It was a stone room, damp and dark, where vegetables were stored in winter and where enslaved people were sometimes punished in summer. She sat on the cold floor, her bound hands in her lap, and felt the weight of her mistakes settling over her like a burial shroud. She'd believed the promise of a white woman. After 72 years of knowing better, of seeing what white people's promises were worth, she'd let hope make her foolish. She'd reached for freedom and grasped poison instead, and now she would die for a crime she'd been coerced into committing by the very woman who was sending her to the gallows. In the darkness of that cellar, Mama Akosa began to sing, softly at first, then stronger, an old song from her grandmother's village, words she'd been forbidden to speak for 70 decades, the language of her people, the sound of home. If she was going to die, she would die remembering who she'd been before slavery tried to erase her. She would die as a Kosa, daughter of a Bena, granddaughter of a Fua, child of the Gold Coast, not as girl, not as property, not as the monster they'd made her into. She would die human. That much at least they couldn't take away. The trial, if you could call it that, was held 3 days later in the Whitmore County Courthouse. It was a small building with white columns meant to revoke justice, but which only ever served to reinforce the existing order. The courtroom filled with white faces, plantation owners and their wives who'd come to see justice performed, which in Georgia in 1857 meant watching a black woman be condemned for daring to exist in ways that frightened them. Mama Akosa was brought in shackled, her gray dress stained with the filth of the cellar, her face bearing the marks of what little sleep she'd managed on that stone floor. The judge was a man named Bartholomew Hayes, 60 years old, with jowls that hung like curtains and eyes that had never looked at an enslaved person with anything resembling compassion. There was no jury of her peers. How could there be? Her peers had no legal standing, no right to judge, no place in this room except as property or evidence. The white men who would decide her fate sat in the jury box, looking at her with expressions ranging from disgust to bored indifference. Constance Thornhill took the stand first, dressed in black bombazine, a handkerchief clutched in her delicate hand. She wept as she testified. Oh, how she wept. Spoke of her beloved husband's sudden decline, spoke of her trust betrayed, spoke of finding the journal entries that revealed his suspicions about Mama Okoso's remedies. He was too kind, she said, her voice breaking beautifully, too trusting. He wanted to believe the best in people, even in those who didn't deserve it, and that goodness killed him. The prosecutor, a young man eager to make his name by condemning a black woman, pressed her with questions designed to horrify. And these African practices she engaged in, Mrs. Thornhill, can you describe them for the court? Dark things, Constance replied, shuddering delicately. She kept strange objects in her quarters, carved figures, stones arranged in patterns, herbs bundled and hung like offerings to false gods. The other Negroes were frightened of her, said she could curse people, could make them sick or well at her whim. Lies built on the fear white people harbored about any knowledge they couldn't control. The courtroom murmured, scandalized and thrilled. House slaves were brought forward to testify, though their testimony held no legal weight and was only included for dramatic effect. They spoke the words they'd been told to speak, avoiding Mama Okosa's eyes, knowing that the punishment for refusing to cooperate would be swift and brutal. Beulah stood there trembling and said, "I seen her mixing strange potions. I seen her talking to herself in that foreign tongue. I was scared of her, sir. We all was." Samuel was forced to testify that he'd seen Mama Okosa bringing tonics to the big house in the weeks before Master Thornhill died. He spoke the words mechanically, his jaw tight with shame, and when he finally stepped down, he looked at Mama Okosa with eyes that begged forgiveness. She had no opportunity to defend herself. No lawyer was appointed to represent her interests. When the judge asked if she had anything to say in her defense, she stood there in her shackles and spoke the only truth that mattered. "I am not a murderer. I am a healer. Everything I did because I was commanded. I mixed remedies because I was told to, and I reached for a promise of freedom because 72 years is too long to be property." The courtroom erupted. How dare she speak of freedom? How dare she suggest she had agency, had desires, had a self that existed beyond her function as a tool for white people's use? Judge Hayes banged his gavel like he was hammering nails into a coffin. "Order! The accused will be silent." But Mama Okosa wasn't finished. If these were to be her final words, she would make them count. "You want to know about witchcraft? You want to know about evil? Look around this room. Look at the hell you built and called it civilization. Look at what you do to people, how you buy and sell and break them, and then you got the nerve to call me wicked?" The bailiff struck her then, a backhanded blow that split her lip and sent her stumbling against the dock. Blood ran down her chin, red and accusing. And the white folks in the courtroom gasped not at the violence, but at her audacity in speaking such words. The jury deliberated for 15 minutes. 15 minutes to decide whether a black woman's life had value, whether her testimony against a white widow's accusations meant anything, whether justice in Georgia meant anything more than maintaining the racial hierarchy but kept cotton flowing and money filling white people's pockets. They returned with a verdict that surprised no one. Guilty of murder through use of poison and African witchcraft. Judge Hayes pronounced the sentence with the solemnity of someone performing a sacred duty. "Okosua, you have been found guilty of the murder of Richard Thornhill through the use of poison and African witchcraft. This court sentences you to death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence. May God have mercy on your soul, though I doubt he extends such grace to heathens and murderers." The courtroom applauded, actually applauded, white people clapping politely as if they just witnessed a particularly moving theatrical performance instead of a legal lynching. Mama Akosua was dragged back to the cellar beneath the big house to await her execution. Constance Thornhill watched to go with eyes that glittered like broken glass, already calculating how to spend her inheritance, already planning her future as a wealthy widow who'd so bravely overcome the betrayal of a murderous slave. And in that cellar, in the darkness and the damp, Mama Akosua sat with her back against the cold stone wall and thought about her grandmother, about the village near the Gold Coast, about the sound of drums and the taste of palm wine and the feeling of belonging to yourself, to your people, to the earth and the ancestors. She thought about freedom, that word that had been dangled before her like bait on a hook. She'd never get to taste it now, but maybe in death she would finally find it. 3 days. She had 3 days left to be human in a world that had spent 72 years trying to convince us she wasn't. If you're enjoying this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. The news of Mama Akosua's sentencing spread through the slave quarters like fever. That evening, after the work in the fields was done and the exhausted people returned to their shacks, a heavy silence settled over everything. There was no singing that night, no stories told around small fires, just a collective grief that pressed down on everyone like a physical weight. Samuel sat outside his shack with his head in his hands. He'd been forced to testify against Mama Akosua, forced to speak words that helped condemn her, and the shame of it was eating him alive from the inside. His wife, a woman named Clara who worked in the laundry, sat beside him and held his shaking shoulders. "Weren't nothing you could do," she whispered. "They would have whipped you bloody if you refused, would have sold you off, would have made it worse for her and for you." "I know that," Samuel replied, his voice breaking, "but knowing don't make it sit any easier. Mama Akosua, she helped birth our daughter. When that fever went through 3 years back, her remedies saved half the quarters, and I stood up there in that courthouse and called her dangerous." In another shack, Beulah cried into her hands while her mother tried to comfort her. The girl was 16, just a child, really, and she'd been forced to lie under oath, forced to portray Mama Akosua as a witch when she knew the old woman had only ever shown her kindness. "She's gonna die because of what I said," Beulah sobbed. "She's gonna hang, and it's my fault." "It ain't your fault, baby girl," her mother said firmly. "It's this whole evil system's fault. It's Mistress Thornhill's fault. It's every white person in that courthouse's fault, but it ain't yours. You just did what you had to do to survive." But survival felt hollow when it came at such a cost. In the big house, Constance Thornhill celebrated her victory with a glass of Richard's best French wine. She sat in the study that had been his domain, her feet up on the ottoman, and imagined the future that was now opening before her. She was 28 years old, a widow with a thriving plantation and no husband to answer to. She could sell some of the slaves, invest in other ventures, maybe even move to Savannah where society was more sophisticated. The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, had left earlier that day, pleased with how neatly everything had been resolved, a murder solved, justice served, the natural order maintained. He'd even complimented Constance on her bravery in bringing the matter to light. She thought about Mama Akosua rotting in that cellar and felt not a shred of remorse. The old woman had served her purpose, had committed the murder Constance needed committed, and now she would pay the price for it, taking all evidence of Constance's involvement to the grave with her. It was perfect, clean, final. What Constance didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that Richard Thornhill had one last surprise waiting for her. In the cellar, Mama Akasua marked the passage of time by the thin strips of daylight that penetrated through the cracks in the door. Dawn to dusk, dusk to dawn, each cycle bringing her closer to the rope. She was given water and cornmeal mush twice a day, delivered by house slaves who wouldn't meet their eyes, who were ashamed and frightened and grief-stricken all at once. On the second night, late when the house was quiet, she heard footsteps on the cellar stairs. The door opened and Samuel slipped inside, holding a small oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. "Mama Akasua," he whispered, kneeling beside her, "I'm so sorry. I'm so damn sorry for what I had to say up there." She reached out with her shackled hands and touched his face. "Hush now, child. I know what they made you do. Don't carry that weight." "I brought you something," he said, pulling a small cloth bundle from his shirt. Inside was a piece of cornbread, some strips of dried meat, and a tiny glass bottle. "That there is laudanum. Not much, but enough to ease things when tomorrow comes, so you don't feel the pain of it." Mama Akusa took the bottle, held it up to the lamplight. Such a small thing to make the difference between a hard death and an easier one. "Thank you, Samuel. You a good man. You take care of your family. Keep 'em strong." "I will," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "And Mama Akusa, we gonna remember you, gonna tell our children about you. Not what they said in that courthouse, the truth about who you really were." After he left, Mama Akusa sat in the darkness and thought about legacy, about memory, about how history gets written by those with the power to write it, and how the truth lives in whispers and songs passed down through generations of the dispossessed. She thought about her grandmother, who told her once that every person contains multitudes, that good people can be forced to do terrible things, that survival sometimes means making choices that break your own heart. She thought about the freedom paper that had never been hers, that had always been a lie, a tool to manipulate her into becoming a murderer. And she thought about Constance Thornhill, who would live free and wealthy while Mama Akusa died for a crime they'd committed together. That was the way of this world. White folks could do evil and walk away clean. Black folks could be victims and still face the punishment. On the morning of her execution, as the first gray light of dawn seeped through the cracks, Mama Akusa drank half of Samuel's laudanum, just enough to dull the terror, not enough to rob her of awareness. She wanted to be present for this final moment, wanted to walk to the gallows with her head high, wanted to die as herself, not as the witch or the murderer they'd painted her to be. They came for her at sunrise, led her out of the cellar, through the house she'd served for 40 years, out into the yard where a scaffold had been erected specifically for this occasion. A crowd had gathered, white folks in their Sunday finest, come to watch justice performed. Enslaved people forced to attend as a warning, a reminder of what happened to those who stepped out of line. The rope waited. The scaffold stood against the morning sky like a monument to cruelty. Simple construction, really. Just wooden beams and a platform with a trap door that would drop her into eternity. The rope dangled from the crossbeam, already fashioned into a noose, the knot tied with a practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. Mama Akosa climbed the 13 steps slowly, her shackled legs making each movement deliberate. The laudanum had taken the sharp edge off her fear, leaving behind a strange clarity. She could see everything with brutal precision. The faces in the crowd, some eager, some uncomfortable, some crying silent tears. The enslaved people standing at the back, forced to witness this as a lesson. Samuel with his head bowed, Beulah with her hands covering her mouth, others whose names she knew, whose children she'd helped birth, whose sicknesses she'd healed with her herbs and knowledge. And there, in the front row of white faces, Constance Thornhill, dressed in her widow's black, a veil covering her face, but Mama Akosa could feel those eyes burning through the fabric, could feel the satisfaction radiating from the woman like heat from a stove. The sheriff stood on the platform, holding a piece of paper with the formal pronouncement of sentence. He read it in a bored voice, the words washing over Mama Akosa like water. Found guilty of murder through use of poison and witchcraft, sentenced to death by hanging, may God have mercy. When he finished, he looked at her with something that might have been curiosity. You got any last words, girl? Mama Akosa looked out at the crowd, at the white faces hungry for her death, at the black faces torn between grief and terror, and Constance Thornhill, the woman who turned her into a weapon and then discarded her. I forgive you, she said, her voice carrying across the silent yard. She was looking directly at Constance when she said it. I forgive you for what you made me become, for the promise you made and broke, for using me and throwing me away. I forgive you. The words weren't for Constance's benefit. They were for her own, a final act of reclaiming her humanity in the face of a system designed to strip it away. Forgiveness as resistance, forgiveness as freedom. Constance's hands, visible beneath her veil, clenched into fists. The sheriff placed the noose around Mama Akosa's neck, the rough hemp scratched against her skin. He adjusted it with professional care, making sure the knot sat in exactly the right position to break her neck cleanly, a mercy of sorts in a merciless moment. Any prayers you want to say? He asked. Mama Akosa closed her eyes, not to pray to the Christian God these people claimed to serve while committing such evil in his name, but to speak to her ancestors in the language they'd shared, words in Twi that flowed from her lips like water finding its course, ancient and unstoppable. Nananam, receive me. Nyame, see my heart. Know that I tried to survive. Know that they broke me but didn't destroy me. Know that I die remembering who I was before they stole me. I am Akosa. I am your daughter. I am coming home. The white folks in the crowd shifted uncomfortably at the strange words, foreign language from a foreign people, incomprehensible and therefore frightening. The sheriff cut her off mid-prayer. Enough of that heathen talk, he said sharply, then raised his hand to signal the executioner. But before the signal could be completed, before the trap door could drop, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. A man on horseback was riding toward the scaffold at full gallop, waving a document in his hand. Stop! Stop the execution! It was Mr. Peterson, the lawyer. His horse's hooves threw up clods of dirt as he pulled to a halt at the base of the scaffold. He was breathing hard, his face flushed and his spectacles askew. The will, Richard Thornhill's will. It must be read before any further action is taken. The sheriff frowned, lowered his hand. What are you talking about, Peterson? We read the will weeks ago. Everything goes to the widow as expected. No, Peterson gasped, dismounting with awkward haste. That was the public will, the standard distribution of property. But I was going through Thornhill's papers this morning doing the final accounting and found another document, a sealed document marked private testament to be read upon my death. It's witnessed and notarized. It's legally binding. Constance had gone very still beneath her veil. Mr. Peterson, I don't see what this has to do with. It has everything to do with it, Mrs. Thornhill, Peterson interrupted, an unusual sharpness in his voice. Because this document, good God, I've never seen anything like it. He climbed onto the platform, unfolded the document with trembling hands, and began to read aloud. His voice shook, not with emotion, but with something like horror, like disbelief at what he was being forced to witness. I, Richard Thornhill, being of sound mind and increasingly burdened conscience, do write this private testament as an accounting of my soul. I have no illusions that it will undo the evil I have perpetrated, but perhaps it will serve as testimony to the truth that polite society chooses to ignore. The crowd had gone silent. Mama Akosa, still standing with the noose around her neck, opened her eyes and listened. Peterson continued, his voice growing stronger. This document does not distribute property. This document lists debts that can never be repaid because they are owed to people I have treated not as humans, but as animals. Let it be known what this plantation cost in human suffering. And then, item by item, Peterson read Richard Thornhill's accounting. Quote, item, for the soul of Maria, sold while pregnant, separated from her unborn child who I sold to a plantation in Alabama, $30 profit. How do you calculate the cost of a mother's grief? Item, for the leg of John, crushed in the cotton gin because I forced men to work equipment while exhausted, resulting in permanent maiming. $20,000 in lost labor. Item, for the back of Samuel, scarred from a whipping I ordered for the crime of looking at a white woman, his dignity worth nothing in my ledger, but priceless in God's. The list went on and on. The lawyer's voice grew hoarse as he continued reading Richard Thornhill's testament of horrors. Each line was a confession, each entry a crime that would never see justice in any earthly court, but which Thornhill had documented with meticulous, damning detail. Quote, item, for the infant daughter of Sarah, who died of fever that could have been prevented had I allowed the doctor to treat slave children as readily as he treats my horses. Value assessed at $200, actual cost immeasurable. Quote, item, for the dignity of Beulah, forced to submit to my overseer's advances under threat of being sold away from her mother, her humanity worth less to me than my convenience. Quote, for the knowledge stolen from Akasua, the healer, whose African wisdom I exploited for my family's benefit while denying her own people basic medical care, treating her expertise as witchcraft when it suited me and medicine when I needed it. Constance Thornhill had gone rigid. Even through the veil, you could sense her fury, her panic, her realization that this document was destroying everything she'd built her plot upon. That's enough, she said sharply, stepping forward. This is clearly the ravings of a sick man, a man whose mind was compromised by poison, Peterson interrupted, looking at her with new eyes. Interesting that you'd mention that, Mrs. Thornhill. The document continued for 2 more pages, an accounting of every enslaved person on the Thornhill plantation, by name with a record of what had been done to them. Families separated, children sold, women raped, men broken, bodies worked until they collapsed, lives measured only by their productive value and discarded when they could no longer generate profit. When Peterson finally finished reading, a terrible silence fell over the gathering. The white folks in the crowd looked uncomfortable, confronted with truth they preferred to keep hidden beneath a veneer of civilization and Christian charity. The enslaved people stood with tears streaming down their faces, hearing their suffering acknowledged, their names spoken, their humanity finally recognized, even if only in a dead man's guilty confession. The document concludes, Peterson said quietly, with this: I have lived as a monster. I have built wealth on the backs of people I refuse to see as human. I cannot undo what I have done, but I can name it. I can testify to the truth, and I can pray that someday, somehow, this great evil of slavery will end and that God will forgive us all, though we deserve no such mercy. Signed, Richard Thornhill, April 15th, 1857. Mama Akosa stood on that platform with a noose still around her neck, and she understood that Richard Thornhill had written this document weeks before his death, before Constance had approached her, before the poison had begun its slow work. He'd been wrestling with his conscience, documenting his crimes, trying to make some kind of peace with what he'd done. And Constance had killed him anyway, had killed him not knowing that he'd already begun the process of acknowledging his sins, of potentially changing his ways, of maybe even considering emancipation. She'd murdered a man who was already dying inside, eaten alive by guilt. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. Sheriff Cooper stood there looking confused and angry. This don't change nothing. She still murdered him. This testament don't erase that crime. Doesn't it? Peterson said softly. Because I'm looking at this document, at the entry about Akosa specifically, and I'm wondering if perhaps Richard Thornhill's death was more complicated than we've been led to believe. Constance's voice turned shrill. Are you suggesting I had something to do with my husband's death? How dare you? I'm the one who brought this woman's crimes to light. I'm the victim here. But the crowd was looking at her differently now, seeing her through the lens of this damning document, seeing her youth, her ambition, her convenient widowhood. Some minds were slower to change, but others were already calculating, already questioning. Peterson held up his hand. I'm suggesting nothing. I'm simply saying that perhaps we should postpone this execution until a more thorough investigation can be conducted. It was too little, too late, and everyone knew it. The execution wouldn't happen. Even if questions were raised, a white woman's word would always carry more weight than an enslaved black woman's truth. Constance would walk free, the plantation would be hers, and Mama Akosua would still die, if not today, then eventually, for the crime of being used as a weapon by someone with more power. But the sheriff, conscious of the crowd's shifting mood, conscious of the questions that were now being raised, made a decision. Execution postponed pending review, he announced. Take her back to the cellar. The noose was removed from Mama Akosua's neck. She was led back down the scaffold steps, back through the crowd that parted for her now with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. Back to the cellar beneath the big house to wait while white folks decided whether her life had value. 3 days later, the review concluded what everyone expected: insufficient evidence to overturn the conviction. Mama Akosua was guilty. The execution would proceed. But in those 3 days, something had shifted. Richard Thornhill's testament had been copied, passed around, discussed in whispers. The enslaved people on the plantation held it like a talisman, proof that their suffering had been witnessed, that their humanity had been acknowledged, even if only by a dead man with a guilty conscience. On a gray morning, 1 week after the first scheduled execution, Mama Akosua was hanged in the yard of the Thornhill plantation. The crowd was smaller this time. Some of the white folks stayed away, uncomfortable with the questions the testament had raised. The enslaved people were still forced to attend, still made to watch as a warning. Constance Thornhill was not there. She'd left the previous day for Savannah, unable to face the execution she'd orchestrated now that Richard's document had contaminated her perfect crime with questions and doubt. As the trap door opened and Mama Akosu's body fell, as her neck broke and her spirit fled, the enslaved people began to sing, softly at first, then louder, a song in English and Twi, words mixing together, a hymn and a work song and a prayer all woven into one, singing her home, singing her free. Mama Akosu died as she had lived, a woman caught between worlds, used by systems she never chose, forced to make impossible decisions in the name of survival. She died guilty of a crime she'd been coerced into committing by a white woman who would face no consequences. She died in a country that called itself Christian while building its wealth on stolen bodies and stolen lives. But she died remembered, her name spoken, her story whispered through generations, the truth preserved even when the official record listed her only as Akosu, Negro female, executed for murder, 1857. Richard Thornhill's testament disappeared from official records within a year. Constance remarried, moved to Charleston, and lived comfortably until her death in 1889. The Thornhill plantation continued operating until the Civil War, when Union troops burned it to the ground. But in the quarters, in the hidden spaces where enslaved people kept their own histories, Mama Akosu's story lived on, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of African witchcraft, as white folks told it, but as a testament to how slavery corrupted everything it touched, how it turned victims into criminals, how it made monsters out of ordinary people just trying to survive. This is the story that history tried to bury, the story of a woman who healed and harmed, who reached for freedom and grasped betrayal, who died for a white woman's crime while that woman walked free into a comfortable future. There are more stories like this appearing on your screen now, stories that need to be remembered, stories that demand to be told. If this story touched you, if it made you feel something, share it, subscribe to this channel, because these voices were silenced once. We won't let them be silenced again. Remember her name, Akosu. Remember that she was human. Remember that this happened. Remember.